Yeah. I'm ready, Carl. I'm just taking one of those BuzzFeed quizzes here. No, they're not stupid, Carl. They actually sometimes they tell you things that are pretty interesting about yourself. So, just because you're normally not happy with the results doesn't mean they're not good quizzes. Trying to figure out what character I am in the Marvel superhero universe. It's gotta be Tony Stark, right? I mean, come on, I'm totally Tony Stark. Well, I mean, now that I think about it, I have a brother who's a little bit more of a Tony Stark character. But it's gotta be Doctor Strange then, right? I mean, it has to be. Okay, let me see here. Good. Yeah. Okay, here comes the results. Please not Hawkeye. Please not Hawkeye. Please not Hawkeye. Okay, here it is. It says, nameless background civilian. You are not a superhero. You have no powers. You have no name. You have no relevance to the plot. The audience does not know your fate, nor do they care, because you are profoundly unimportant. No, Carl, Hawkeye doesn't sound so bad now. Hi, and welcome to episode 8 of this lecture series on the problem of evil. Today, we're going to discuss the devil. More specifically, we're going to look at the Theodicy of Gregory Boyd, who develops a cosmic warfare theodicy in which Satan and demons are responsible for natural evils in the same way that humans are responsible for certain moral evils. In order to understand Boyd's theodicy, we're first going to provide a context for it. This context will include his understanding of cosmic warfare, his understanding of God, and his understanding of evil. Next, we're going to place Boyd on the quadrant of theodicies with regard to whether or not he thinks God is responsible for evil and whether or not he believes God has the power to stop evil. Next, we're going to look at those 3 diagnostic questions. How does evil originate? Why does evil persist? And will God bring about a definitive victory over evil? Lastly, of course, we're going to engage in a brief critical evaluation of Boyd's theodicy. Let's get started. Boyd develops his theodicy within a broader worldview. This worldview is one of cosmic warfare. The idea that the entire world is somehow caught up in a battle between spiritual forces of good, God, God's angels, and spiritual forces of darkness, Satan and demons. This warfare is not wholly relegated to the spiritual realm. It has ramifications in the physical realm as well, and we, as human beings, experience these ramifications. Next, we want to consider Boyd's understanding of God. Boyd's understanding of God fits within the open and relational theology category. In this category, God essentially sets aside God's power and God's knowledge in order to create a world of genuinely free creatures. God sets aside God's power so that these creatures can have genuine freedom. That is, God doesn't control everything that they do. God sets aside God's knowledge so that these creatures can have a genuine impact on the narrative of history such that the future is unknowable even to God. For Boyd, the word evil has a very broad connotation. It of course includes the obvious cases of moral evil, murder, genocide, sexual assault, so on and so forth. But it also includes any harms that creatures experience, or any events that cause creatures harm. This can include predation, one animal eating another animal. It can include disease. It can also include natural disasters, especially when these natural disasters cause harm to sentient creatures. In essence then, everywhere where there is a harm, Boyd is somehow identifying some level or some type of evil. It follows that any sentient creature can be the victim of evil. Given that definition of evil, there's a whole lot of evil in the world. So why is it there? Is God responsible for this evil? Recall that in our last episode we evaluated the theodicy of John Hick. Hick maintained that God was responsible for the evil in the world, because God designed a world in which evil was inevitable and or necessary. Boyd is going to take a very different approach. In Boyd's theodicy, God is not responsible for evil. Other free agents, whether human or angelic, are responsible for all evils that occur. With regard to power, it's a little bit more complicated. God could have created any kind of world God wanted, or no world at all. However, because God chooses to create a world that God cannot control, this world entails the risk that evil might obtain. Now note here that for Boyd, it's only a risk. Recall that for Hick, evil was inevitable. For Boyd, the world God creates does not inevitably lead to evil. However, evil is a risk. So this is going to raise some questions. Even if evil is a risk, why does God not act to prevent it? In order to really understand the broader framework of Boyd's theodicy, we have to consider 6 fundamental claims that he makes. First, genuine love cannot be coerced. If love is genuine, it must be freely chosen. it follows that if God wants to create a world with creatures who can genuinely love, God must sacrifice control over those creatures so that they can choose to love. If God forced us to love, it wouldn't actually be love. It therefore follows that free creatures must be able to say no to love. 2. Because free creatures can refuse the offer of love, it follows that a creation that has free creatures in it necessarily entails a risk. That is, a risk that creatures will reject love. 3. Freedom must mean the ability to do good and the ability to do evil. If free creatures in God's creation have the ability to love and do good to one another, it follows that those same creatures must also have the ability to hate and do harm to one another. In other words, if you had creatures who could only love and could only do good to one another, those creatures would not be genuinely free, at least not in the way that empowers them to love one another. Therefore, the risk that's entailed in creation is the risk of hate and harm. 4. A creature's potential for good is matched proportionally by the creature's potential for evil. When we're talking about free creatures, the more potential that they have for good, the more potential they also have for evil. Creatures that can give life can also kill. Creatures that can heal can also harm. Creatures that can love can also hate. It would follow also that creatures that have greater powers, such as angels, creatures who can do greater things than human beings can also do greater harms than human beings can do. Freedom entails a proportionality of the potential for good and the potential for evil. 5. If creaturely freedom is genuine, it must be at least temporarily irrevocable. That is, God can't just give freedom to creatures and then take it away anytime they use it in a way that God doesn't like. If freedom is to be genuine, then God must respect the manner in which creatures choose to exercise their freedom. Based on this claim, Boyd maintains that God actually enters into a covenant of non-coercion with free creatures. This covenant essentially means that God will not intervene to control the way that creatures use their freedom. The final claim that Boyd makes is that this covenant of non-coercion is temporary. God makes it for a period of time so that free creatures can exercise their freedom. However, there are limits to the covenant itself. We're going to get into more detail about that as we go throughout the video, but here just bear in mind that the covenant itself is not eternal. It has an end date, an expiration date, at which point God can act in coercive ways to overturn human freedom. With these 6 claims in place, we can really begin to see how Boyd is going to answer our diagnostic questions. First, how did evil originate? Well, most basically, evil originated out of the risk that God took in giving creatures freedom. This might sound familiar to Alvin Plantinga's free will response, and it essentially is. However, Boyd acknowledges, as does Plantinga, that humans cannot be the culprit for certain kinds of evils in the world. Humans can't be responsible for all types of cancer, for natural disasters, for predation in the non-human world, because all of these things predated human existence. Therefore, human beings cannot be responsible for them. Now, whereas at this point, Hick is going to say, well, God is responsible for those natural evils that occur, Boyd is going to suggest, no, it's not God, it's another type of free creature, fallen angels. That is, Satan and his fallen angels, or demons, are responsible for what we perceive as natural evils. I put quotes around natural evils there because they're not really natural evils anymore. They are moral evils. They're just moral evils that derive from different kinds of moral agents, not humans, but angels. It follows for Boyd that every type of evil that we encounter in this world somehow is the result of the abuse of free will, whether human free will or angelic free will. But let's take a second to consider what Boyd is actually saying here. Recall our scientific awareness that certain kinds of things like disease and natural disasters and predation seem to be an inevitable outcome of the very structure of the world. Well, Boyd acknowledges this point as well. It follows that when he says that angels are responsible for these kinds of harms, what he actually means is that angels, fallen angels, are responsible for warping the very laws of the cosmos such that these kinds of harms are inevitable. In other words, God created angels so powerful that they could actually change the very structure at the foundational level of the world that God creates. In essence then, when we're talking about angelic evil, we're talking not simply about acts that angels commit, we're talking about the very structure of the cosmos that angels have warped. And going back to Boyd's claim about proportionality, it must follow that angels had a proportional amount of potential for good to all of that evil, except that some of them, like Satan, misused that potential and turned it toward evil instead of good. Okay, so we know why evil originated in Boyd's Theodicy. Why does it persist, and why does it persist to the amount that it persists? Well, again, Boyd's claims cover this question. God has created a covenant of non-coercion with creatures because freedom, if it is to be genuine freedom, must be irrevocable. The reason God doesn't intervene to prevent evils from occurring or persisting is because God has made a covenant of non-coercion with not only humans, but also with angels. God must therefore honor the terms of this covenant, even when that means horrible harms result from God honoring that covenant. Now, this claim raises a very interesting question. What about the times that God does intervene to prevent evil from occurring or persisting? What about miracles? What about when God rescues Israel from Egypt? When Jesus heals the sick? When God raises the dead? Certainly these seem to be examples of God interacting with the cosmos in a manner that either prevents harms or undoes harms that are caused by free creatures. How can God do this? Wouldn't this be a violation of the covenant of non-coercion? Boyd is aware of this issue, and he maintains that God in fact does at times coercively intervene in the cosmos to prevent evil. So why is this not a violation of God's covenant of non-coercion? Well, Boyd has two responses to this. First, God makes a covenant of non-coercion with individual creatures, and each covenant has a different temporal limit. Therefore, some covenants might end before other covenants end. It follows that God might be able to stop one creature from doing evil, but not stop another creature from doing evil, because one covenant is still in place, and the other covenant has reached its end. Second, the covenant also has other limitations. Boyd maintains that the covenant of non-coercion that is made with each individual creature has particular boundaries to it, not just temporal boundaries, but boundaries that cannot be exceeded by the creature's exercise of freedom. Boyd then argues that in any given situation, there are a number of factors, what Boyd calls givens, that weigh in on whether or not God is still bound to the covenant of non-coercion with that creature. We don't know what these givens are. We can't really identify them. However, Boyd maintains that when we see God intervening miraculously, we must therefore assume that somehow the givens of that situation mean that God is no longer bound to the covenant of non-coercion with regard to that particular evil or the creature who is causing that particular evil. In short then, Boyd argues that God never violates the covenant of non-coercion. Anytime that God does intervene coercively to prevent evil or to undo evil that has occurred, we must assume that there is some reason that God is not violating the covenant of non-coercion in that instance. Either the covenant has reached its temporal limits, or there are other givens in the situation that mean the covenant is no longer binding in that situation. So now we know how evil originated and why evil persists. Can we have hope that God will eradicate evil? Well, the answer should be, I hope, clear here. Because Boyd maintains that every covenant of non-coercion has temporal limits, at some point in history, every covenant will have reached its temporal limit. Therefore, God will be able to coercively act in a manner that affects the entire cosmos. For Boyd, this is the point at which God will bring about a definitive victory over evil. An eschatological victory, if you will. Having now examined the main points of Boyd's Theodicy, including how it holds up to our three diagnostic questions, let's offer here a brief critical evaluation of it. First, what's good about Boyd's Theodicy? Well, on the one hand, I think we should acknowledge that Boyd's notion of cosmic warfare fits really well within both the biblical tradition and the tradition of the Christian church. Another good point of Boyd's Theodicy is he doesn't reject the science. He does acknowledge that our cosmos is such that natural evils appear to be inevitable. He affirms the notion of biological evolution and all the harms that result from it. He doesn't shy away from these things in order to exonerate God. And inasmuch as we want a theodicy that can account for the world as it actually is, we should take this as a positive thing. Third, Boyd's 6 claims are very well articulated and do create at least a relatively coherent worldview. They fit together quite nicely to present good responses to the 3 diagnostic questions we want to ask of every theodicy. All of these things suggest that Boyd has offered us something to think about, and that's why he deserves a place in these conversations about different theodicies. However, as you might expect, there are a number of difficulties with Boyd's Theodicy. Let's take a look at a few. Again, the critiques I'm going to focus on here are not exhaustive, it's just a few that I want to put on the table that I think we should consider. And they're sufficient to demonstrate that Boyd's Theodicy has some holes in it. First, let's start off with another scientific fact that I think Boyd doesn't account for quite as well. The world as we know it relies on the kind of structure that Boyd actually says was created by not God, but by fallen angels, Satan and demons. It seems to follow from this that the world that you and I inhabit now, and in fact our very lives and our relationships, are more the result of Satan's creative actions than of God's creative actions. In other words, because fallen angels have had such a dramatic impact on the cosmos, it seems like they're more our creators than God is. And that seems to be a theological problem. There's also a number of internal inconsistencies in Boyd's theodicy as well. Recall that Boyd maintains that God does at times coercively intervene in the cosmos to prevent evil or to undo evil that has occurred. He also argues that God only ever does this when God is somehow no longer bound to the covenant of non-coercion that God made. This seems a lot like a kind of circular reasoning. Consider it this way. Boyd says God never violates the covenant of non-coercion. He also acknowledges that there are times when God appears to violate the covenant of non-coercion. He then says that in those times, there must be reasons that God is no longer bound to the covenant of non-coercion. Why do we assume this? Well, we assume this because God never violates the covenant of non-coercion. There's a circular reasoning involved here that doesn't quite have any explanatory value. It seems that miracles are simply explained away by assuming the conclusion is the same as our first premise. God never violates the covenant of non-coercion. In essence, Boyd just appeals to mystery here. He acknowledges that there seems to be something in the world, evidence, that grinds against his claims about God's covenant of non-coercion. He doesn't explain why this is acceptable. He just says it is for reasons that we can't really identify. And if the point of a theodicy is to create a cohesive worldview, at that point the theodicy kind of fails. There's a sense of special pleading that's just explaining away evidence that stands contrary to Boyd's claims. Another thing we might ask of Boyd's theodicy is, why did God give angels so much power? God gave angels so much power that they could actually warp the very structure of the cosmos, such that every creature that exists in that cosmos after they do this will be the victim of these enormous harms, these great evils? Why give angels that much power? Boyd doesn't really explain this. He just says, well, God must have. But that seems like a terrible risk-reward ratio. Certainly God could have given angels power to influence the world, but not necessarily completely alter its structure. That just seems like overkill. Boyd maintains that the covenant of non-coercion means that God cannot prevent evil, but also that God cannot undo evil caused by creatures with whom God is in a covenant of non-coercion. Now this raises some very interesting questions. There were a lot of people, for example, who were responsible for the death of Jesus. Certainly demonic presence was active there in the execution of Jesus, and yet God undoes the harm that was done to Jesus by bringing Jesus back from the dead. It really strains credulity to maintain that God could undo the harm that was caused to Jesus, because it means that all those creatures who had a hand in Jesus' death, their covenant of non-coercion must have been somehow no longer binding upon God. It just seems like special pleading. Jesus happened to be killed by all creatures with whom the covenant of non-coercion was no longer binding, so God could undo the harm that they caused, but none other of the billions of people that die in the world fall under that category? It just doesn't make sense. I mean, it's logically possible that that's the case, but it doesn't seem at all plausible. Finally, there seems to be some inconsistency with Boyd's claim about proportionality. Recall that Boyd says creatures have an equal proportion to do good and evil. That's one of his claims about free will. But consider, fallen angels seem to be able to warp the structure of the cosmos such that evil is inevitable. And yet good angels don't seem to have the power to unwarp the cosmos. That is, they don't seem to have the power to restructure the cosmos such that evil is not inevitable. Also, if angels are so powerful that they can change the very structure of the cosmos, why can't angels heal people of disease? Why can't angels bring people back from the dead? Why can't angels stop natural disasters from occurring? In other words, it seems like fallen angels have a lot more power to do bad than good angels have the power to do good. That seems to be a violation of Boyd's proportionality claim. We might also argue the same thing for humans. Human beings, for example, can heal and give birth and do good to one another. But it does seem to be that human beings can do more harm. That is, human beings can kill other human beings. We can't bring human beings back from the dead. Human beings can cause incurable diseases. That means we can't cure some of the diseases that we cause. Again, proportionality doesn't seem to quite work that well. It seems like most creatures have more potential for harm than for good. Why would God make the world this way? Again, this is not an exhaustive list of criticisms that might apply to Boyd's theodicy, But I think the list is sufficient to demonstrate that his theodicy is not quite as solid as we might hope. There are lots of holes, there are inconsistencies, there are appeals to mystery. And so again, we find that we haven't definitively exonerated God in the face of evil. We've created a system that makes sense up to a degree, and then it requires appeals to mystery, special pleading, so on and so forth, in order to kind of get at that last point. It's like that old cartoon of the person trying to solve a math problem, and they have tons of work over here on the math problem, a solution over here, and this gap between the work and the solution, with a nice little thing written in chalk, here a miracle occurs. And that's how we get from the amount of work we were able to do to the solution that we want to reach. Well, things don't quite work that way. We really need to fill that gap in with explanatory value, otherwise we have an incomprehensive worldview. So this raises the question, is there another theodicy out there that might work better? To find the answer to that question, you're going to have to come back for future videos. We're going to continue exploring theodicies over the next couple weeks. In the meantime, farewell. I mean, I don't understand, Carl. It's just, why... I wouldn't be a nameless citizen. Oh wait, here's a different one. This is what Lord of the Rings character would you be? I gotta do better here. Come on, seriously. Fantasy is like totally my genre. Okay. Probably Aragorn, I would think. Maybe Boromir if they're feeling a bit chippy, but come on. Okay. I don't understand why whether I prefer ducks or chickens has anything to do with this quiz. I feel like I'm gonna go with chickens though. Okay, calculating results. Nameless character dead in a ditch. BuzzFeed, man.